An Introduction to Freud's Theory of Personality, Psychic Energy and Instincts, Part 3 of 7, Dr. Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. In this installment of Personality Psychology, we're going to talk about what I think is the single most important part of Freudian theory that most students don't get to learn about. At its heart, Freud's theory is a theory of psychic energy ebbing and flowing through the psyche and resulting in systematic changes in behavior. So unless you understand how psychic energy works, you really don't understand Freud. Now, I don't tell you this as an apologist for Freud, but just as someone who has been working on teaching his theory in a reasonable way and in a way that makes a whole lot of sense. So from my perspective, without understanding psychic energy, you really don't understand Freud. So let's see what Freud has to say about the notion of psychic energy, and it starts with a wish. According to Freud, all psychic energy is originally transferred from physical processes to psychological ones. Now, this is important because Freud's theory is a closed theory of psychic energy. The only place you can get psychic energy from is physiological processes. We'll discuss Carl Jung's theory next. He has a radically different view on that idea than Freud did. But basically what Freud says is you consume some calories, or as normal people say it, you eat something, and some of that caloric intake gets transferred to run our bodies, and some of it goes to the brain and operates our brain. Now, Freud is probably not too terribly wrong about this notion. The biology folks can tell you that despite the fact that your brain probably weighs approximately 3 pounds, it consumes about 30% of all the calories that you intake. That's an on-average figure. Individuals may vary. So anyway, we eat something, some of it gets turned into energy for our bodies, some of it gets turned into energy for our psyches. So, Freud believed that psychic energy was important because we used it for several things. First of all, we used it to stay at a level of homeostasis, not getting too aroused, not being too under-aroused. Homeostasis in Freud's theory is the most important state for an organism to be in. And that'll become apparent when we start explaining some of the other ideas. Freud's model is also oftentimes viewed as a tension reduction or hydraulic model. Tension builds up until it needs to be released, and usually it's released in some form of action. Also, psychic energy may displace other centers of psychic energy, and we may sublimate some of our psychic energy to do great things. This will become apparent when you look at the anxiety and defense mechanism video. So basically, let's take a basic biological function, hunger. And Freud said that ultimately all of our instincts, and I'll explain what an instinct is shortly, are based on taking care of ultimately a biological need. Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Do you need sex? Do you need thermal regulation? you lack one of these biologically motivating things for a while, and tension builds and builds until it's released. And we'll talk about how that works in a few minutes. A Freudian instinct basically can also be called a wish. In Freud, wish and instinct are interchangeable. And for Freud, the technical definition of an instinct is a psychological representation of an inner source, somatic is physical, of excitement. So we have a wish, and that wish is that we're no longer excited. We're in that even keel state of homeostasis. Now, in Freud's theory, there are 4 parts to an instinct. Now, before we start going there, I want to tell you that the terms that are used here are standard terms in the Freudian translations. A lot of these terms don't translate terribly well to English. So bear with me. I don't want to make up new words for ideas that have been around for a long time. So look at these ideas. So let's look at an instinct. First of all, we have the source of an instinct. The source is some kind of bodily instinct or condition that activates the instinct. If you haven't eaten for a while, you might be hungry. Same for thirst, same for thermal regulation, and yes, even for sex. So you have these biological urges, they activate an instinct. In other words, the longer you go without food, the more you think about food. And basically the arousal of the instinct signals the organism that something needs to be done, some wish needs to be fulfilled. Freud calls this bodily need or condition the source. There are 2 important characteristics for the aim. Now, another word to describe the aim of an instinct is to also talk about the goal. What do you need to satisfy the tension or arousal? First of all, the aim removes the bodily excitement and returns you to a homeostatic state. Also, the aim must be regressive, and it's also conservative. Now, regressive has nothing to do with the defense mechanism, regression, and conservative has nothing to do with politics. Let me try to explain this. So here is a little curve I made up. Not great artistic effort, but the best I could do. Let's say that we're talking about hunger. So the longer that an organism doesn't eat, the more arousal it gets. Eventually, over time, let's say the organism does consume some food, the tension is reduced and the organism goes back to a normal state, a homeostatic state. That's the easy way of looking at things. So you have regression from hunger to satiation. Let's add a ripple, and it really is a ripple because I couldn't get this to look pretty. So let's say that you overeat. And now you've gone past a homeostatic state where you're satiated to a state where now you feel physical distress because you have some gastrointestinal problems. So by conservative, we mean the system needs to use just enough psychic energy to return to homeostasis and not go overboard and create a new tension or a new problem. I think one of the better ways to explain this than my bad PowerPoint drawings is an ancient 1972 commercial that is for Alka-Seltzer. And I remember this from when I was a kid. Let's see if we can get it to play. Give me a second at the controls here. Okay. Here we go.
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
You ate it, Ralph.
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
No, Ralph, I ate it.
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
Take 2 Alka-Seltzer.
Alka-Seltzer neutralizes all the acid your stomach has churned out. For your upset stomach and headache, take Alka-Seltzer and feel better fast.
Did you drink your Alka-Seltzer?
The whole thing.
I think there isn't a better way to explain the tension reduction from overeating than that old 1972 commercial. So, let's look at our next component of a Freudian instinct, and that's the object. What is going to take care of the physical need? Now, since we're talking about hunger, found the biggest sandwich on the internet that I could possibly find. So the object has 2 components. The task required to obtain the object and the object itself. So let's say that you're going to get one of these big cardiovascular bypass burgers. That's what I call it. So you have to take care of the object, somehow get this object. Now you might do it in a variety of ways. You might get into a drive-through line and purchase one, but you also need to get the money. You might have to go to the ATM or use your plastic or transfer some money or do something. Or you might just have plain old cold hard cash. So it's the steps that you need to secure the object as well as the object itself. Now, being the kind of guy I am, I can't shy away from too many sexual examples, and I'll drift into one a little bit here. Now, you probably heard the term the object of my affection. Well, this is the same kind of thing. The person who is making you crazy, that you're infatuated with. The object of your affection. Now, we're not talking about objectifying a person. That's a whole different ball game. But from a Freudian view, the person that you are, let's say, in lust with, is the object of your affections. Then finally, we have the impetus. Again, one of the biggest burgers I could find. And the impetus is the force or the strength of the need. When I'm teaching face-to-face, oftentimes I teach this class from 10 to 12, but oftentimes also from 12 to 2. During the 12 to 2 session, you can tell that my food examples are starting to get to some of my students. Most likely they rolled out of bed 9:30 for a 10 o'clock class, threw some clothes on, ran to school, sat down in the classroom, and didn't eat any breakfast. So a lot of our students take classes back to back to back to back. So let's say that you miss breakfast, and then you're sitting through a class from 12 to 2, which is normally lunchtime, and some professor keeps on talking about food. Well, your force or strength of the need is going to get stronger and stronger, and at 2 o'clock you're going to want to bust loose, hop in your car, and get to the nearest drive-thru. If you woke up a little bit early, maybe you went to Denny's and had a big grand slam breakfast with your friends, where you ate half a dozen eggs and a pound of bacon and a whole bunch of sausages and hash browns and toast. The lecture's not going to affect you because you're really full at that point. And I'm picking on Denny's a little bit. Apologies to anybody that works there. So the impetus is the strength. How badly do you need something? If you've gone without something for a very, very long time, the impetus is going to be far stronger than if you've had that need taken care of a short time ago. Now, another issue that we have to talk about here is the whole notion of our bodies being electrochemical entities, bioelectrochemical entities, but I'm focusing on the electrical right now. It was in discovering the speed of conductance of the nervous system. In fact, the whole genre of Frankenstein movies and books and films start with Mary Shelley. And Mary Shelley's monster essentially was a reanimated individual. And that was a big philosophical question at the time. If we run out of electricity, are we dead? Is there anything left? So there are two philosophical schools of thought on that. The vitalist and the anti-vitalist. Now, the vitalist believed that there was a spark of life. And when that spark left the body, you died. The materialist or anti-vitalist, I have the slide mistaken here, and I'm just too tired to fix it. So it should be the materialist and anti-vitalist versus the vitalist. The materialists just say we're the sum total of our electrobiochemical processes. And when we die, that's it. There's nothing left. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, etc., etc. So this is where Frankenstein comes from. And people were becoming fascinated with the nervous system, how it worked, and the electrical nature of it. And it turns out that if you look at some other phenomena, that you can see the same kind of tension reduction model in the nervous system. So here is a neural firing chart from a old intro psych book or something like that. You learn in Psych 10, and one thing I never have problem getting appropriate responses to from my students in face-to-face classes is I ask them, can a neuron fire a little bit? Well, you've hopefully learned that already, or at least you've read the title to the slide. No, neurons either fire or they don't fire. But if you look at this, you get arousal, then you get a release, and then you get a refractory period, and then you get back into a resting or homeostatic state. So neurons work the same way as Freud's tension reduction model does. Much later, in the 1960s, Masters and Johnson determined several curves for human orgasm. Notice again, human orgasm is arousal, excitement, and then you have the orgasm, and then you have a return to a homeostatic state. That works for both men and women. We guys are far more simplistic than the women are, and you can see Masters and Johnson laid out several different potential curves for female orgasm, although they still have the same basic components of arousal, orgasm, and return to a homeostatic state. So we may not agree with Freud on lots of stuff, but at least the tension reduction part of his model seems to inherently make sense. Now, Freud talks about two major groups of instincts. And we have these laid out as the libidinal instincts, which we'll talk about first, and the thantatic ones, which is the second set. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon. It happens a lot in psychology and science. You have opposing structures. So many people misconstrue libidinal instincts as simply sex. But the libidinal instincts are anything having to do with the human drive for self-preservation as well as reproduction. Since it is very sexually charged, Freud also makes the case that as far as libido is concerned, humans can sexualize anything. The object of our affections be a wide variety of things, hopefully including another person. So, for example, if someone has some kind of fetish, they may be placing libidinal or life instincts onto inanimate things that arouse them, like maybe lingerie, shoes, things like that. There was a reality show a little while ago called My Strange Obsession, and you had people falling in love with all kinds of weird inanimate objects. So anything that you can project life energy on can become sexual according to Freud. Let me show you a short clip for the movie Something About Mary that gets at the character Woogie's fetish. If I can get my cursor there. Here we go.
Oh, Mary, you got this all wrong. I'm not going anywhere. Mm-mm. Not until I get something to remember you by. You're pathetic.
Obviously, quite the shoe fetish there. And you see that Dom, or the Woogie character, has sexualized Mary's shoes. So again, this reinforces Freud's primary point, that we can sexualize anything. The opposing set of Freudian instincts are the thantatic instinct, or Thantos. My extremely bad joke about that is Thantos is not a breath mint. But Thantos are the death instincts. If the libidinal instincts are the sex part of the stereotyped Freud statement, that everything with Freud is sex and aggression, Thantos is aggression. It's the death instinct. It also subsumes our aggressive tendencies. And Freud would say that death is the ultimate tension reduction. So some individuals attempt to move through their life and strive to die. Not a very pleasant thing to think about. But if you die, you've actually eliminated all of the tension in your system, haven't you? One Freudian explanation of the phenomena of suicide is that a person is so bent out of shape, so much tension in their system, that the only way they can think of relieving that tension is to harm themselves. Now, this naturally isn't anything that I would suggest by any means. And if you have any of these tendencies to want to hurt yourself, please see somebody who can help you over those things. But that's the other set of Freudian instincts. As we talked about earlier, Freud said all of our behavior is motivated, and we may cathect some energy into that, and you get the famous notion of the Freudian slip. So here is a cartoon I stole off the web with Freud and his first slip. Then here's another set of panels from a cartoon that gets at the whole notion of unconscious motivation and Freudian slips. So Freudian slip is when you say one thing, but mean your mother. I mean another. Freud shuts up and gets quiet there. So a Freudian slip releases our unconscious motivation. So, as I previously discussed, I think psychic energy is the most important component in understanding Freud's theory. It puts everything into context, especially the relationship between the different parts of the psyche. Let me relay one of my favorite stories about unconscious motivation to you. I was working as a TA with another student when I was in graduate school, and technically, instructors aren't supposed to date students. It's against the rules. But graduate students are kind of a different case, because once a graduate student finishes their role as a teaching assistant, dating their former students is kind of fair game. So a friend of mine who I was team teaching a class with, during the class became hopelessly infatuated with one of his students. Well, semesters always come to an end in academia, and the semester ended, and we were at a department mixer, and at that mixer, which was for the Psych Student Honors Group, who had invited the TAs, who in turn go anywhere that there's free food, he saw this as, we'll put it into the context of things, objects of his affection. And she was wearing a nice dress. Now, my friend was, let's say, a little light on social skills. And have you ever had a friend when you're someplace that wants to ask someone out, they start asking for guidance, and they end up saying, well, what should I say? How should I ask her? What should I do to make sure she goes out with me and all of this stuff? And I said, well, you got to think of something. Just think of something pretty basic. And he comes up with the line, what a nice dress you have on today. And that's what he was going to tell her. That was his big line. May not be the line that you would use or you would respond to favorably, but he was going with it. Well, in the meantime, while we were having this little diatribe, the young lady, who had good social skills, walked over to her former instructors to talk to us. And I was getting ready to just say some greetings and then move on and let them chat. But before I could do that, my friend uttered what I consider one of the greatest Freudian slips of all time. Instead of saying, my, what a nice dress you have on today, it came out as, my, what nice breast you have on today. Obviously looking at the latent unconscious sexual motivation. Well, she was embarrassed, turned and walked one way. He was embarrassed and turned and walked the other way. And I just stood in the middle of the room by myself, trying to keep from laughing hysterically. But it's a story I've been able to use for over 30 years to explain unconscious motivation and Freudian slips. So remember, when you think of Freud, think of psychic energy, not his mother. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin, all rights reserved.